Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of interesting news that we are looking at this morning. So first of all, some big questions about just how accurate the midterm polls are. A little bit of deja vu here. Yes. So a lot of caveats about some of the numbers you may be seeing coming out. Nate Cohn at the New York Times has been digging into that. So we'll break all of that down for you. Also, the very latest developments in terms of that Ukraine counteroffensive. Wildly successful thus far. They continue to gain ground. What does it mean? And what is the reaction within Russia? That is also very interesting. Now, we have a vote coming up allegedly on gay marriage. Some real questions over whether Democrats will be able to pull sufficient Republican votes to overcome the filibuster. Some new updates about who is in and who is out in terms of that vote and what all of that means. Also, some new legal developments with regard to Trump and the whole MAGA world. Actually, very interesting. So you had sent this to me last week. Steve Bannon out there saying like 30, I think he said 36 people's homes were raided, right? Yes. Well, maybe not exactly accurate, but we have just learned that something like 40 subpoenas were served to various former Trump aides and acolytes just in the past week. So major escalation in terms of the DOJ's effort there. We also have an update for you on our good friend Brian Stelter, where he is headed next. Today, for real, Jeff Stein is going to join us to talk about we had some technical issues with Jeff yesterday, but today we feel confident we're going to get him in to talk about the legal case against student loan debt being crafted by Republicans. Okay, so let's start with the polls. Big breakdown from Nate Cohn over at the New York Times, seeing a lot of the same signs that we saw in 2020, that the polls in some key states are once again overstating Democratic support. So let's go ahead and put this first piece up on the screen here. The headline here is, yes, the polling warning signs are flashing again. Let me read you a little bit of this because I think it is very illustrative, this one example they give in particular. He says that early in the 2020 cycle, they noticed that Joe Biden seemed to be outperforming Hillary Clinton in the same places where the polls overestimated her support 4 years earlier. The pattern didn't necessarily mean the polls would be wrong. It could have just reflected Mr. Biden's promised strength among white working class voters, for instance, but it was a warning sign. Of course, that warning sign did turn out to be correct in 2020. Of course, Joe Biden did win, but you'll recall some of the polls were wildly off, especially in places like Ohio, Wisconsin. Sort of the industrial Midwest has been a real issue for pollsters lately. So they give the example of Wisconsin. On paper, they say the Republican Senator Ron Johnson ought to be favored to win re-election. The 538 Fundamentals Index, for instance, makes him a 2-point favorite. Instead, the polls have exceeded the wildest expectations of Democrats. The state's gold standard Marquette Law School survey even showed the Democrat Mandela Barnes leading Mr. Johnson by 7 percentage points. But in this case, good for Wisconsin Democrats might be too good to be true. The state was ground zero for survey error in 2020 when pre-election polls proved too good to be true for Mr. Biden. In the end, the polls overestimated him by about 8 percentage points. Eerily enough, Mr. Barnes is faring better than expected by an almost identical margin. Now, most pollsters, he also says, haven't made significant methodological changes since the misses of 2020. I mean, at least after 2016, there was a theory of why the polls might be better. In 2016, they had a theory about why they were so off. It was like, oh, we're underestimating. We're not looking at the education status and class status. We're undercounting white working class voters in particular. Okay, we've made the adjustments. This time we've got it. And then 2020 comes through and you have a very, very similar polling miss in some of the very same states that they missed in 2016. But this time around, the pollster didn't really even pretend to know why. There were some theories and there was some conjecture that we covered, like liberals are home during the pandemic or liberals are just really excited to answer polls, but nothing was really adjusted in the methodology. So it would follow that you may have some of the very same polling errors that you had last time around.
This is the thing I don't understand, which is that, and people who are polling nerds might recall this, the polls in 2012 were actually very good. Everybody remembers Nate Silver, the 538 website called like almost all 50 states, like most of the Senate races. His book became a national bestseller. I mean, many others were like, oh my God, it's finally been cracked. And I think really what has happened is that Trump genuinely did change everything about American politics. He changed the type of people who voted. He changed the type of people who came out. Basically made the models of the people who do come out to vote just completely change in the demographics and traditional ones that you could use. And from that point forward, they just haven't been able to figure out. In a way, it's like a reflection of our society. We've got a political realignment going on. We have a much more online population, people not answering phones as much. And at a certain point, the industry also just doesn't know what to do. And it does make it so that many of these have to be greeted by people like ourselves. We have the best data that we possibly can.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, most people in the media, Krystal, are not giving the caveats outside of this one guy. And even he's been criticized. I saw some
He's
people.
getting a lot of criticism.
People,
yeah.
Democrats, predictably are like, well, no one's ever wrong for understating Democratic support. It's like, well, that hasn't happened in like 8 years.
Yeah.
Okay? So, I don't know where you're coming from. Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, there are occasional polls. Like, for example, Colorado seems to be a state where the polls kind of consistently underestimate Democratic support.
Right.
So there are a few states that are like that, but overwhelmingly the issue has been in the other direction, and especially in states where you have a large white working class vote. I think this is speculation because no one really knows exactly why this is going on, but I think it's not just changing who's voting, the types of people are voting, the coalitions of the various parties, but I think with Trump you have such an overt, like, anti-institution messaging and orientation that he's also making his voters more skeptical of responding to polls and, talking to pollsters and those sorts of things. So I think that might be part of it as well. But, like everybody else, I don't really know. Let's take a look at this next piece, which is a chart showing if the polling miss is as big as it was in 2020, what will the results actually look like? And let me just go through these. So in Colorado, basically, right now the poll says Dem is +9. If there's a 2020-like poll error, the Dem will win by 9. So Colorado is pretty much on the money last time around. In Pennsylvania, right now the polls have Fetterman up by 8. If you have a 2020-like poll error, you will end up with Fetterman by 5. So he still wins, but by less. In Arizona, you cut the Dem lead from 8, which is reflected in the polls, down to 6. In Wisconsin, this is the big one, you cut the Dem lead from 4 to a Republican win by 4. In Nevada, you have +3 for the Democrats right now. That one would be a true toss-up, less than 1 for the Dems. In Georgia right now, you've got +2 Dem. Georgia's been fairly accurate, and lo and behold, Georgia's also one of the states where the polling has continued to be very, very tight, basically in line with what your expectation would be for that state. North Carolina right now is showing Dem +1. With that 2020-like poll error, you'd get +2 Republicans. Ohio, this is another big, big one. Again, industrial Midwest, large white working class voter base. Right now, you've got Tim Ryan, the Democrat, leading by less than 1 percentage point. With an error similar to 2020, you've got J.D. Vance easily winning here by 7 points, which I think is more in line with what you would expect. Florida's the last one on the list here right now. They have Marco Rubio leading that, the Republican, by 5. If you have a 2020-like poll error, Marco Rubio will easily win that race by 11 points. So if you look at this in totality, first of all, you see the Senate, the race for the Senate to control the Senate is extremely, extremely close. Republicans only have to net 1 single seat. So essentially, you're looking at probably control of the Senate coming down to very close races in Nevada and Georgia to determine control of the Senate. If you look at, and this is the commentary from Holly Otterbein here, she says, as it happens, the "if polls were as wrong as they were in 2020" column from today's New York Times story seems more in line with where political insiders actually think these races are. So, our general rule of thumb here has been, especially in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, to knock a few points off of the Democratic, whatever their polls are saying. That's kind of a good rule of thumb if you look at this chart.
Oh, completely. Look, I mean, the idea of runaway Democratic victories in these formerly, quote, blue wall states, I just think it's a fantasy. Has been since 2016. The Fetterman +5 as opposed to +8, 11, or whatever people are saying, that reads much more in line with what Pennsylvania appears to be.
I still think +5 for Fetterman.
Yeah, it's probably still too high.
Overstating.
Exactly. I mean, listen, Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016.
It's just a very closely divided state.
He only lost Pennsylvania by 1 percentage point. It's like in that environment, there's just no way a Democrat's going to win by 11 points. Even if they do win, it's going to be like Virginia, where Glenn Youngkin, how much do you win by? Like 1.5% point in an absolute red wave victory. So that's what people have to consider. Same Wisconsin. Everybody's been like, oh, Ron Johnson. And listen, we'll talk about Ron Johnson later in the show. Maybe he's trying everything he do to lose, but he did that last time and he also won by basically coming out and, defying the polls. You also found this, which I thought was really important. Let's put this up there, which is that those of us who were in 2018, the media cast it very much as a blue Dem wave. But as Philip Bump points out here, 2018 was not the outlier that people think. Senate polls that year were also very off the mark. It's the national House polling, which wasn't. Everybody focused on Pelosi and all of that. But I remember also at the time, people were considering, oh my gosh, Marsha Blackburn might lose in Tennessee. Yeah, that didn't happen. They're like, oh, well, we're going to see big red gains in some of these states.
Amy McGrath going to win in Kentucky.
Yeah, none of these things happened. And everyone does seem to just memory hole. I mean, I will never forget ahead of the election, Wisconsin supposedly being Trump minus 17 or Biden plus 17 in Wisconsin. Or even in 2020, I mean, remember Jamie Harrison? They were like, Jamie Harrison is within 1 point of South Carolina. He lost by 17 points. He literally lost by the same margin as the last person who ran against Lindsey Graham. He just took $18 million more to do it, and now he's the DNC chair.
Yeah.
Somebody go in and riddle me that. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Well, the important point about 2018 is, first of all, part of why the result, even though it was a good year for Democrats, women really came out, the sort of suburban vote consolidated behind Democrats. They did, they gained control of the House. Like, it was a good year for them. But part of why it fell short of expectations is because you did have polling misses. So there's been this kind of conventional wisdom that has developed of like, oh, well, the problem with polling only happens when Trump's on the ballot. Happened in 2016 and happened in 2020. What this chart shows is that's not really true. You also had significant polling misses in 2018, even when Trump wasn't on the ballot. Now, you might say, okay, but he was in the White House and the election was really a referendum on him. And it was. But Trump is kind of still central to our politics right now. It's not like the guy is sidelined and not being talked about. He is very, very central to whatever is going to happen this midterm. So what I would say is, if we think back to that chart showing, okay, well, if you have as much of a polling miss in this year as you had in 2020, what is the result going to be? Ultimately, if it came down that way, Democrats would still end up with control of the Senate. It would still be, on balance, a very good year for them and much, much better than what they were expecting going in. But it's not going to be as good as some of the most hopeful estimates and what the polling reflects right now. And also, by the way, this is a landscape with the assumed polling miss where Republicans easily gain control of the House. That's not really in question.
Right.
So, we have been talking a lot about how much the mood has shifted, how much things have shifted towards Democrats post-Dobbs. That's all totally true. But just keep in mind, that doesn't mean they're going to win control of the House, certainly, and it doesn't mean they're going to win control of the Senate. It's going to be very, very tight, and it is probably going to come down to very close races in Georgia and very close races in Nevada. So those things are all really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's underscore that. It's tight. It's much tighter than people will have you believe. I think Dobbs made it so that it has the chance of a couple of Democratic victories and upsets. But the chance is all that exists, not like the shoe-in that people are casting.
Let me just play devil's advocate here and give the other side of the case, which is that, okay, but we've had special election results.
Right.
And not only have they gone for Democrats, those polls going into those special elections have actually understated Democratic support. So that's what someone who would argue in favor. No, it's actually going to be a blue wave. No, actually Ron Johnson is on the ropes. No, actually Tim Ryan could pick up this seat in Ohio. That's what they would point to. Now, the, again, reason to sort of temper expectations, even with those results, which I do think are important and maybe the most important piece of data that we have that does indicate something is different happening here in terms of Democrats. But what we saw in those elections is, first of all, in a special election, you're going to have a smaller voter turnout. you still had Republicans doing very well in rural areas and actually increasing their vote total even over Donald Trump in certain instances in rural areas. But there was a huge flood in these sort of like liberal, especially college towns. That's not going to be representative of everywhere across the country. So that's a reason to take some of those results with a little bit of a grain of salt.
I think that's exactly what I was going to say. I was like, yeah, well, the special elections are interesting, but they're more suburban, more educated. That's not the whole electorate. That doesn't work out in a white working class state, smaller turnout, higher national mood. You know, the midterms are just going to be more of a national referendum. And so whatever way the winds are blowing, that's probably going to be more indicative.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.